Hi everybody, I'm Emily Shire, Bustle's politics editor, and we have quite the guest today. I'm very excited. We have the Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro with us. He is a rising star in the Democratic Party. You should all be very excited and chiming in with your questions on Facebook Live. You can comment below, but I've got so many that I want to ask myself, so I'm going to jump right in. But first of all, thank you for coming to our office today. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you for having me, Emily. This is a totally cool office, too.
It has its moments.
Much like the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania, I might add.
I imagine Harrisburg is just like this.
Just like this, yes.
As many of you probably know, you made headlines a few weeks ago because you shared an exchange you had with President Trump when there was a meeting of the Attorneys General. I actually said that correctly this time,
yes,
guys.
Yes, you did. Good job.
I've practiced. Where you brought up to him some of the issues involving the spate of anti-Semitic threats and some of the vandalism, some of which happened to a cemetery in your own home state. And you said that his response was, sometimes it's the reverse, to make people or to make others look bad. And could you just talk a little bit about that exchange, how it came up, at what point in your meeting with him?
Well, let me set the table for you. The president invited the Attorney General to come to the White House and visit with him. And I'll be honest with you, some Democratic AGs didn't want to go. I felt that it was my responsibility to go, even though I profoundly disagree with this president and obviously did not support him. But I represent 13 million Pennsylvanians. I thought it was important to go hear the president out. He had us in the East Room, and he gave a few extemporaneous remarks, and then asked if anyone had any questions. And I raised my hand and asked a question. I said, Mr. President, there's been a rise of hate speech, threats, and intimidation against minority communities all across this country. And in particular, in my home state of Pennsylvania, we'd seen a rise in anti-Semitism. 2 JCCs were evacuated in central Pennsylvania. Just a couple days before that, we had a Jewish day school in southeastern PA, just outside Philadelphia, evacuated. And we had a cemetery where Jewish tombstones were knocked over by vandals a few days before that. And my question to the president was very simple. What can the federal government and state law enforcement do together to combat these threats? Kind of a softball question, actually, I thought. And the president said it was reprehensible, but then went on to say, you have to be careful because sometimes the reverse can be true. And he repeated the word reverse a couple times, which made several of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, say, what is he talking about? The truth is, I don't know what the president meant. I know that there are some of these alt-right websites and even some people associated with Trump's campaign or in Trump, some of his advisors, who seem to kind of give credence to this notion that somehow these are just false actions, that somehow, the Jews are knocking over their own tombstones, or African Americans are phoning in racist, threats and intimidation. And I think that's really irresponsible, that kind of rhetoric. And I think we need to make sure that anyone, including the President of the United States, condemns that type of hate speech, threats, and intimidation in no uncertain terms, and that we all work together in order to combat that. Here's the last thing I'll say about this. This week, it's Jewish Americans, American Jews, who are receiving those threats. Next week, it could be our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. It could be women. It could be people of color, whatever the case may be. No group is safe when one particular person is targeted because of what they look like, who they love, where they come from. And we need to be vigilant against that, the President of the United States and everyone else.
What do you think the president needs to be doing differently in response? I mean, what is the answer that you would have liked to have received? What do you hope he will say and do differently?
I would have hoped he would have said in no uncertain terms, we condemn it, and then spoken specifically with us, law enforcement leaders of our respective states, on how we could work together to combat anti-Semitism, to combat racism and hate speech, threats, and intimidation. There should be no wiggle room to give people who view this otherwise any opening. Here's the bottom line. Leaders need to speak with moral clarity. You need to speak with moral clarity on these issues, especially when you're the President of the United States.
And what is your response? Because, frankly, I heard these debates. The one person they've apprehended, who they say only accounts for, who is, and I must say has been charged. So has been charged with only a handful, a fraction of what would have been involved. But as someone who, by all accounts, seems to have been trying to frame a girlfriend, who wasn't, someone from the alt-right. What is your response to make sure that there's still focus on investigating the larger issues behind it? How do you respond to people who say like, oh, Trump was right, or this isn't a real concern?
So Trump wasn't right. I mean, there have been hundreds of these threats, and in fact, there were threats carried out after that individual that you referenced was apprehended. So clearly, he's not responsible for all of that. And I can tell you that the investigation is very active and very ongoing.
And going back to that, clearly this exchange probably colored your entire meeting with the president. But overall, when you met with him, with your fellow attorneys general, did you feel more or less confident about his presidency?
Candidly, I was, look, you need to take a step back and say to yourself, okay, clearly you don't support this person. But I will say, I hope the president succeeds, because if he succeeds, then the country succeeds, even though he's clearly not my choice. But I was, given that, I was surprised at how little he seemed to know about basic policy issues. Someone brought up the Affordable Care Act, something I support, and he really didn't seem to fully understand the broader issues that were at play there. He did not seem to have a depth of understanding of the topics that we discussed. And that's troubling to me. And when you combine that with his irresponsible speech, his irresponsible tweets, the basic untruths that he tells, it is really concerning to me. It really is.
And on that note, what do you see as the role of attorneys general under President Trump?
So, back in school, we all learned about checks and balances, right? I learned about it, I'm sure you learned about it. And the checks and balances we always learned about were horizontal, right? So you've got the courts, you've got the Congress, and you've got the executive branch, the president, and they're all separate but equal branches of government. And I think what we're beginning to see, because Congress has seemingly abrogated its responsibility in that checks and balance structure from a horizontal perspective, that we're seeing vertical checks and balances. So you're seeing the states and state attorneys general become a check on the federal executive branch. And I think that's really critical. When it comes to protecting immigrant rights, like we did on the travel ban, standing up and ultimately pushing this in a court that has suspended the travel ban, or whether it's defending a woman's right to choose, or whether it's defending LGBT rights. I think you're going to see state attorneys general stand up for the rule of law and begin to push back and have a checks and balances that needs to be, should frankly be apparent at a horizontal level, but it doesn't seem that it is right now.
And what do you think are the biggest challenges for a Democratic attorney general like yourself?
Well, look, for me, I have to always be mindful of the fact that it's about the rule of law. Right? The president is going to do things that I disagree with, but is lawful, and it's not really my role to weigh in on. It is my role to weigh in on things that I think are unlawful, like the travel ban, which is why I led 17 states in signing an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, to support the litigation out in Washington State, which ultimately resulted in the first travel ban effectively being nullified because it was suspended and then the president pulled it out. So I think for me, the test is always about the rule of law, not whether I like or dislike something the president's doing, but the rule of law, and I'm going to focus on continuing to do that work.
What is your perspective on the second executive order, the second version, some might say, of that travel ban?
I think it's hard to unring the bell of discrimination. And I think you saw the judge in Hawaii basically say that even though the president changed the words on the piece of paper, the executive order, the intent, he believes, the judge believes, is still the same, and that is to be discriminatory against a particular group of people based on their faith. And I think if that is ultimately the calculus that the courts hold, that is very, very dangerous for our democracy, and it's something that we need to constantly and consistently speak out against.
Do you think the law will be challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court? Or?
Well, it's hard to predict what the courts will do. I would assume that it's going to make its way to the Supreme Court, but I don't know. I just think it's important to stand up and speak out on what you think is right.
Now, this is part of your responsibilities as the Attorney General for Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. You deal with a lot of issues that are specific to Pennsylvania citizens.
I do.
And then you also deal with these larger federal issues. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate what you choose to take on and manage that balance between state versus national concerns?
When I was sworn in, I gave a speech to folks who were there. And I talked about my fundamental responsibility being to protect the safety, welfare and interests and rights of the people of Pennsylvania. And whether it was a dealer on the street corner, a multinational corporation, or even the President of the United States, I would stand up and protect the interests and rights of Pennsylvanians. That's my litmus test. So when the President put forth his first travel ban, which I thought undermined the interest of students in Pennsylvania who were from one of those 7 affected nations, or healthcare providers who trained in one of those nations, I stood up in defense of the rights and interests of the people of Pennsylvania. When I take down a heroin ring, it is to defend the interests and rights of Pennsylvanians. When I go after a child predator, it's to defend the children of Pennsylvania. So for me, that's the litmus test. How are we going to defend the rights and interests of the people of Pennsylvania, whether it's the President of the United States encroaching on them or a dealer on the street corner?
And how do you navigate your role? Because I've noticed from your social media presence, you're pretty openly critical of the American Health Care Act, Trump Care, whatever you want to call it. And what can you do, if you can explain to our viewers, as a state attorney general, to challenge, should it be passed, the Republican replacement for Obamacare? What is your role in that?
Well, and just to be clear, it's not my job to go make law. That's the job of congressmen and senators and the president. And I don't want that job. That's not what I want to do. I love what I'm doing. But I think it is my job to point out things that are critically important to my state. So for example, you brought up the, whatever the new Obamacare is going to be called, the American Health Care Act, I guess you call it. I spoke out against the fact that the initial bill that Speaker Ryan presented and the President supports totally cuts funding for drug and alcohol treatment. Well, my state is facing a massive threat from heroin and opioids, much like many states across the union. It's the #1 accidental killer in Pennsylvania. And I've said many times, you can't arrest your way out of this crisis. Sometimes people who are addicts need treatment, not incarceration. So if we're going to say they need treatment in order to deal with this big threat in my community, why then is it a good idea to go cut drug treatment? So I spoke out against this American Health Care Act because I thought it was really important that they know that this drug treatment is critical to my state. It's critical to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so I speak out against it from that perspective, not from the perspective of wanting to be involved in the sausage making down there. I'll leave that to others. I just think it's critical that they understand the impact it's going to have on the Commonwealth and my ability to go out and keep people safe and deal with the heroin and opioid epidemic.
What do you see as the role of state attorneys general when it's something like the Trump administration rescinding the executive order protection for transgender students? Is that a place where you potentially see an opening, or it falls into that category that you're talking about of, I don't agree certainly with everything the president does, but it's not my job to make the laws? Sure.
Well, I stood with Gavin, and Pennsylvania, under my leadership, signed on to the amicus brief, signed on to the friend of the court brief, because I thought that was really critical. I'm going to continue when it comes to protecting people's rights to speak out and to take legal action where I can to protect the interests of Pennsylvanians. What I meant before, my comment is, it's not my job to go pass bills. It's not my job to draft amendments to those bills, but it is my job to keep the people of Pennsylvania safe and protect their rights, and I'll speak out when it comes to that.
And you had another issue that, and I got a notice from our lovely Lauren about it, that people are writing in online that they're very curious about what state attorneys general can do regarding reproductive rights. And I know that must be tricky because, unless it's directly affecting your state, I imagine what you can do is limited to nothing. Like, you can't do anything about the Ohio heartbeat bill. You couldn't have done it.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go right ahead. I was like, which was not signed into law ultimately, but in something like that, even though it's next door, you clearly can't directly interfere.
Today in Pennsylvania, there is a bill that actually passed the state Senate, which is making its way through the state House, which would dramatically roll back protections for women to make decisions over their own bodies. Make it so that after 20 weeks, you could no longer have an abortion in Pennsylvania. I believe that to be unconstitutional. I believe that to be patently unfair to women. I believe it to roll back legal protections that exist today. So I will speak up on that fact. I will continue to make my thoughts known on that here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
That's really fascinating. I mean, in that kind of stage of the game, do you wait for the law? You clearly have to wait for whether the governor will sign the law, how far along it gets. How do you kind of self-monitor at what stage of the game you comment on legislation?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't want to get myself involved in the daily grind of the legislative process, but at some point, you know, lawmakers, the governor will, you know, potentially ask for my opinion on the constitutionality of something. And when that occurs, there's a formal mechanism for me to be able to opine. But make no mistake, I mean, I have spent my career defending women's rights. I've spent my career standing up for a woman's right to choose. They know where I stand, and I will continue to voice that in speeches. I'll continue to voice that on social media. I'll continue to voice that wherever I can. And as the chief legal officer of Pennsylvania, I will always stand up for a woman's right to choose.
What have been some of your chief goals for the state of Pennsylvania, or rather the residents of Pennsylvania, what you hope to achieve during your tenure as Attorney General?
I said, first and foremost, we've got to restore integrity to the Office of Attorney General. There's so many good people there, but our office had been under a cloud when my predecessor had been convicted of a crime. So we have got to make sure that we restore integrity. And why is that important to people? Because they need to know that every single decision that we make in that office is being done for the right reasons, that we are applying the law without fear and without favor, and that every single person's rights are going to be protected. I've also said that I want to be the people's Attorney General, the one person every single Pennsylvanian can rely on to protect their interests and their rights, whether it's going out and dealing with the heroin and opioid epidemic, which we talked about a few moments ago, or protecting your grandparents and elderly Pennsylvanians who are victims of scams. Nearly $1 billion a year is taken out of their pockets, fleeced out of their pockets from scams that exist. Protecting our kids online, making sure that our environment is safe and protected, ensuring that civil rights are looked after. I mean, these are all things that are critically important to me, and that I'll be fighting for, and I am fighting for each and every day.
Now, this is diving a little more into politics, and I know you're not a governor, you're not a senator, not yet anyway, but you are a proud and outspoken member of the Democratic Party, and yeah. I would love your thoughts on what happened in the election. You live in a swing state, and what you think perhaps needs to be done differently for Democrats to do better in 2018, 2020.
Look, I come from a state where the top of my ticket lost and I won. In fact, someone said the other day, you better be careful about taking on Donald Trump and this travel ban in your state. After all, he won Pennsylvania. And I said, well, Donald Trump better be careful about pushing the travel ban in my state, because I won in Pennsylvania too. And I say that not to pat myself on the back, but I say that because it's important that people understand the issues that I care about, the progressive values that I have, and many watching here have, weren't rejected at the ballot box in Pennsylvania. Because otherwise, how do you explain me winning and Donald Trump also winning? I think it became more about two things. Number one, people, and number two, purpose. I think you have to connect with people when you run for office in every single part of the communities that you represent. You can't just go to some parts of Pennsylvania. You have to go all over, and we did that. And you have to run with purpose. You have to have a reason for being. And those reasons for being have to be things that are ultimately going to improve the lives of the people that you're trying to serve. So I went to communities like Johnstown, where Donald Trump won there, but I did pretty well and outperformed the top of our ticket there as well. And I say that again, not to pat myself on the back, but to show that if you focus on connecting with people and if you run with purpose, you can win even in what ultimately turned out to be a red state. But here's the final thing I'll say about this. This election ultimately came down to about 75,000 votes in 3 states. If you total up Donald Trump's margin of victory in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the total amount was 75,000 votes. So the issues, many of which we've talked about here today, weren't rejected at the ballot box. Ultimately, as I said before, it came down to people, and it came down to making sure you connect on policies that will matter to them.
And you have actually been, if we're talking about larger politics, you have been speculated about as a possible candidate for Congress, for Senate, for governor even. I was curious why you chose to run for state attorney general.
I was asked by Senator Schumer to run for United States Senate over the course of many weeks, and I chose not to. I actually said that I wanted to be attorney general because I believe this is the most impactful job in government today. And that was even before President Trump won, and this took on, I think, even added importance. When I go to work every day, I want to do work for the people that I serve. I don't want to just go out and give speeches. I don't want to just pontificate. I actually want to do things that are meaningful for people. And I want to have a decision be made and have something happen as a result of that decision. I don't think there's a better job in government today where I can do that than being Attorney General. I get to protect people's rights. I get to make sure the communities are safe. I get to go out and ensure equality in our communities. These are things that I think are fundamental to our democracy. It's fundamental to who I am. And ultimately, I think this is the most impactful job in government today.
Lauren has told me that we have a few questions from our viewers, so let's take them.
We have a question from Leslie. She actually wants to know, what is your response to the attacks on reproductive health at the state and local levels?
Well, Leslie, I appreciate the question. It's something that, as we talked about a moment ago, in Pennsylvania, we're seeing an attack on women's rights. We're seeing an attack on women's reproductive rights by trying to roll back protections from 24 weeks to 20 weeks. I'll continue to speak out against that. I think it's unconstitutional, and I hope the legislature ultimately does not send the bill to the governor, although the governor has made it clear that he would veto it if it hits his desk.
I believe we have another question from, we have a lot of people chiming in. We don't always get that.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
I'm
Fire away.
So our next question is from Petroius. Hope I'm pronouncing his name right. How will you protect transgender students from discrimination? How will you protect members of the LGBTQ community at large?
Well, I'm proud of my record standing up for LGBTQ citizens in Pennsylvania. In fact, when I was in my previous role as a county commissioner, sort of like the mayor of our county in Pennsylvania, in Montgomery County, we became the first of Pennsylvania's 67 counties to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Boy, I was so proud of that. It was the only day I cried at work when I saw those first marriage licenses being issued. And I have to say that that commitment to the LGBT community continues as the Chief Legal Officer for Pennsylvania. I will always stand up and protect their rights. And notwithstanding the rollbacks that we're beginning to see at the federal level from the Trump administration, I think LGBTQ citizens in Pennsylvania know that I'll be on their side and I'll stand up and protect their interests and their rights.
And I believe there was yet another question. This is incredible.
Our next question is from Andrew. He wants to know if you will protect Pennsylvanians' drinking water.
Andrew, well, thank you for asking that question. That was one of the themes in my campaign, that a mom, when she turns on the faucet, or a dad, when he turns on the faucet for his young kids, as I have 4 young kids, shouldn't have to worry about the tap water that comes out and the quality of the drinking water. In Pennsylvania, we have a constitutional right to clean air and pure water. So it's my responsibility to protect people's constitutional rights to have that. And so whether the polluter is a fracking company, or the polluter is some other industry, or the polluter is some individual who's dumping into our streams and rivers and undermining the quality of our drinking water, I will hold them accountable in Pennsylvania.
And I am going to close with a question that stems from my own personal curiosity.
Sure.
Do you see yourself running for higher office, perhaps one day even the White House?
I love what I'm doing, and I think what I'm doing is having an important impact on people's lives in Pennsylvania, and I think I'm doing the job at a critically important time, and I'm going to focus on doing my work and not looking too far ahead, but I appreciate the question.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for tuning in. It was such a pleasure to have the Attorney General here.
Thank you.
Thank you all.